Hello, everyone. My name is Iris Curtis, and I'm an auditor with the Office of Community Services, Division of Energy Assistance. We're glad you could join us today for the webinar on internal controls for effective LIHEAP program and fiscal management, which features speakers from our monitoring support contractor, ICF. This is the third in a series of webinars on fiscal topics that the Division of Energy Assistance is co-hosting with ICF this summer. This webinar will cover the benefits of having effective internal controls in place for both programmatic and fiscal management. I hope you find today's topic useful in reviewing your own internal controls so that you can continue to assure HHS that you have an effective fiscal and program management process in place. In this presentation, you'll learn the definition of internal controls. You'll also learn how having effective internal controls can help prevent and deter fraud, waste, and abuse. Once you've determined what internal controls work best for your program, we'll discuss how to document those policies. Lastly, we'll discuss the importance of communicating your internal control policies. If you were part of the second webinar, Sub-Grantee Fiscal Monitoring, we asked you to let us know the topic or topics you would like ICF to discuss in the fourth and final webinar. And based on your answers, the final webinar will focus on tips for developing a risk assessment tool and showcase of some notable program and fiscal practices from federal LIHEAP compliance reviews. We will send out a save the date for that webinar, which is currently scheduled to take place on Thursday, August the 27th. So please keep an eye out for that save the date notice. Now, let's get started on learning about effective internal controls. ICF?
Thanks, Iris, and hi everyone. Thanks again for joining us. My name is Chetan Mahajan. I'm with ICF, and we're glad you could join us today for our webinar on internal controls. The presenters from the ICF team will be Jason Clevenger, Didi Shelkey, and Audra Thanikary. Many of you already know us as we work closely with LIHEAP program and fiscal teams at the Office of Community Services to support program and fiscal monitoring. And since 2012, we've visited more than 260 LIHEAP grantees, subrecipients, and local agencies for our monitoring work. So over the years, we've all spent a lot of really good time with many of you to learn more about your programs. Just a quick request before we move on. Please do bear with us if you hear any background noise. With current circumstances, we're all working from home right now, but we will try our best to minimize the background noise. So on our previous webinars for single audit findings and sub-grantee fiscal monitoring, to help set the stage for each webinar, we provided a breakdown for how to approach each webinar topic with a focus on accountability. For this webinar on internal controls, we take another view on accountability, where internal controls are at the heart of our accountability efforts as they provide structure and control over our activities so as to help us achieve our objectives. We all have goals we're trying to accomplish within our programs, especially around being compliant and performing efficiently and effectively. And internal controls help us take a step back and look internally at the ways we control our activities to then reach an objective. So again, internal controls offer us an internal, introspective approach to finding ways to tighten up our operations to have better control.
Thanks, Chetan. Hi, everyone. I'm Audra Thanikary. Thank you for joining us. During today's webinar, we will cover several topics related to internal control for both program and fiscal operations. First, we'll provide an overview and definition for internal control. We will also discuss resources for internal control guidance and LIHEAP-specific internal control requirements. Next, in detail, we will discuss control activities, including what is a control activity, and types, benefits, and examples of control activities. We will also explain how and why control activities should be documented through policies and procedures, communicated internally and externally, and reviewed periodically. Lastly, we will share LIHEAP internal control issues from recent OCS monitoring site visits and the corrective action plans to resolve those issues. We will also show examples of notable practices we observed during our monitoring visits that touch on internal controls. At the end of the presentation, we will answer any questions you may have. So what is internal control? An internal control is a process used by an organization to help them achieve an objective. Objectives can be broadly classified into three categories: operations, reporting, and compliance. So internal controls help an organization run its operations effectively and efficiently, report reliable information about its operations, and comply with applicable laws and regulations. In the government sector, objectives related to compliance with applicable laws and regulations are very important. We will discuss the specific regulations related to internal controls for which LIHEAP grantees must be in compliance. Sub-objectives can be derived from these three main objectives. For example, an important sub-objective is the safeguarding of assets. Internal controls to safeguard assets provide reasonable assurance regarding the prevention or detection of unauthorized acquisition, use, or disposition of an organization's assets, including federally awarded funds.
Hi everyone, I'm Dee Dee Shelke. Thanks for joining us. So now that we know internal control is simply a process used by organizations to help them achieve its objectives, let's discuss a high-level process flow for using internal controls to achieve objectives. First, identify objectives to meet the organization's mission, strategic plan, goals, and regulations. Objectives should be defined in specific and measurable terms to enable management to identify and analyze risk relating to achieving those objectives. Risk is simply any event that potentially prevents an organization from achieving its objectives. After objectives are identified, next, controls or actions are designed and put into place to prevent identified risks and therefore help organizations achieve their objectives. However, no matter how well designed, implemented, or operated, internal controls cannot provide absolute assurance that all of an organization's objectives will be met. Factors outside the organization's control can affect its ability to achieve objectives. Therefore, once in place, effective internal controls provide reasonable but not absolute assurance that an organization will achieve its objectives. So there are 5 components of internal control, and all 5 components should be operating together for internal controls to be effective. So let's go over the 5 components. First, control environment, which is the foundation for internal controls. It provides the discipline and structure which affect the overall quality of internal controls. Next, risk assessment, which includes assessing the risk facing an organization as it seeks to achieve its objectives. This process should include assessing risks from both external and internal sources. Then there's control activities, which are actions established through policies and procedures to help achieve objectives and respond to risks. And it's the focus of this webinar. Then there's information and communication, which is the quality of information management and personnel communicate and use to support internal controls. And finally, monitoring, which are activities management performs to assess the quality of internal controls and to promptly resolve audit and monitoring findings. Now, all 5 components are important, and as previously pointed out, all 5 components should be operating together for internal controls to be effective. As mentioned, this webinar is focused on the control activities component, But to learn more information on the other 4 components, there's 2 good resources: COSO's Internal Control Integrated Framework and the Standards for Internal Control in the Federal Government, also known as the Green Book. We'll introduce these 2 resources in just a minute.
Thanks, Dee Dee. Hi, everybody. My name is Jason Clevenger, and it's great to be with you today. I'm going to start taking us through some resources for internal control guidance, requirements, and regulations. Let's go over a couple of resources for internal control guidance that both you, your program, and fiscal staff should be aware of. First, there's the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission, or COSO. COSO's Internal Control Integrated Framework is one of the most widely adopted internal control frameworks worldwide. The purpose of the framework is to be used for designing, implementing, and performing internal control and assessing the effectiveness of internal control. Next, there is the Government Accountability Office, or GAO's Green Book, which adapted principles from COSO's framework. Although the Green Book defines standards for internal control in the federal government, it's often used as a framework to design, implement, and operate internal control for state, local, and quasi-governmental entities, as well as for not-for-profit organizations. When auditing firms review the spending of federal funds by states, tribes, and territories, they often refer to the Green Book for internal control standards. Please keep in mind you should follow your own state, tribal, and territorial requirements for internal controls, and how to adopt and implement these principles into your organization's practices will be up to you.
Now let's discuss LIHEAP laws and assurances related to internal controls. When we speak about federal law, we always must look first to the relevant statutes because they are the first source of implementing congressional legislation. The LIHEAP statute contains 16 assurances that LIHEAP grantees' highest officials, such as governor or tribal chief, certify to as part of the annual LIHEAP plan submission each fall. The assurances provide requirements that include internal control elements, but most specifically, let's focus on Assurance 10. This assurance requires that LIHEAP grantees provide fiscal control and fund accounting procedures that will be established as necessary to assure the proper dispersal of and accounting for federal funds, and provides that grantees will comply with the Single Audit Act. Although Assurance 10 most specifically speaks to internal controls, meeting the requirements of all your LIHEAP assurances are based on having sound internal controls. And all assurances have elements of internal controls that both program and fiscal staff should be aware of.
Thanks, Dee Dee. Let's discuss federal regulations that relate to internal controls. We know the LIHEAP statute requires internal controls, and therefore the federal HHS regulations at 45 Code of Federal Regulations 96.30A also require all of you to have sufficient fiscal controls that an independent person or entity can retrace how you spent the funds and ensure those obligations and expenditures did not violate the federal requirements of the LIHEAP grant. Additionally, the Federal Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, issued regulations called the Uniform Administrative Guidance. HHS adopted these regulations at 45 CFR Part 75. Only some sections of the Uniform Administrative Guidance are required of LIHEAP grantees. There is a section that spells out details related to internal controls. While this section is not expressly required of LIHEAP grantees, it can serve as a helpful recommendations or guidance to you as you reconcile what internal controls are required under your own state, tribal, or territory-wide rules with what else may be needed for your LIHEAP funding specifically. So that section, 45 CFR 75.303A, provides that internal controls should be in compliance with guidance in Standards for Internal Control in the Federal Government issued by the Comptroller General of the United States or the Internal Control Integrated Framework issued by COSO.
The Uniform Administrative Guidance at 45 CFR 75.303E further recommends that non-federal entity must take reasonable measures to safeguard protected personally identifiable information, or PII, and other information the HHS awarding agency, pass-through entity, or non-federal entity designates as sensitive. The next section, 45 CFR Part 75, Subpart F of the Federal Uniform Administrative Guidance is required of all LIHEAP grantees and subgrantees that expend $750,000 or more in federal funds in 1 year. But remember, this is $750,000 across all sources of federal funding combined. This regulation requires that you obtain a single independent audit, which is an organization-wide financial statement and federal award audit of non-federal entities. We covered single audits in a previous webinar, so you may remember that their intent is to provide assurance to the federal government that a non-federal entity has adequate internal controls in place and is generally in compliance with program requirements. And then there's LIHEAP regulation at 45 CFR 96.84C, which requires all LIHEAP grantees to prevent waste, fraud, and abuse. LIHEAP grantees must establish appropriate systems and procedures to prevent, detect, and correct waste, fraud, and abuse in activities funded under the LIHEAP. The systems and procedures are to address possible waste, fraud, and abuse by clients, vendors, and administrating agencies. However, please keep in mind that under the block grant philosophy, each grantee is responsible for designing and implementing its own program within these very broad federal guidelines. And grantees should administer their programs according to their approved LIHEAP model plan and in compliance with their own entity's rules and policies, including ensuring that except where otherwise required by federal law or regulation, you are obligating and expending LIHEAP funds in accordance with the laws and procedures applicable to the obligation and expenditure of your own state, tribe, or territorial funds. Links to these LIHEAP requirements and regulations and internal control guidance resources will be provided on the references slide at the end of the webinar.
So before we go into a detailed discussion on internal control activities, we wanted to ask you all a question. For this poll, we'd like to ask you, from your own experiences, what activity do you find the most challenging? A, developing effective ways of being compliant. B, implementing activities to be compliant. Or C, ensuring that you maintain compliance. Take a look at these potential answers and please type the corresponding letter for your response in the questions box. Okay, so had a few responses. Seeing a lot of, kind of a mixed bag here. Did see a lot of C's pop up. Some more B's, mixed bag. Some A's as well. Okay, a lot of C's. Tells us that people are finding some challenges with ensuring that they maintain compliance. That's good for us to know. Go ahead and give you a few more moments to get your responses in. Okay, wow, this was really interesting. It's really helpful to know this. It looks like people, we had a lot of varying answers on this one, but what this does is it helps us get a better sense of how we can better provide guidance to you on establishing internal controls. And we'll definitely use this feedback as we go forward. So thank you for your responses. As previously mentioned, out of the 5 components of internal control, this webinar is focused on control activities. The other components are important, and we encourage you to review the Green Book or COSO's Internal Control Integrated Framework for information on them. But for now, let's start a discussion on control activities.
Control activities are the actions management establishes through policies and procedures to help achieve objectives and respond to risk. Before developing control activities, program and fiscal staff should consider the objectives they are trying to achieve and/or the risks they are trying to mitigate so that the most effective control activities are developed. There are several different types of control activities. The most common classifications of control activities include preventive or detective and automated or manual. For preventive or detective control activities, the main difference is the timing of the control activity. A preventive control activity prevents an organization from failing to achieve an objective or address a risk. A detective control activity detects when an organization is not achieving an objective or addressing a risk so that the necessary corrections can be made. Automated control activities are either wholly or partially automated through information technology. Manual control activities are performed by individuals with minor use of information technology. Automated control activities should be more reliable because they are less susceptible to human error and are typically more efficient. To help explain the differences between preventive, detective, automated, and manual control activities, let me walk through an example. As LIHEAP grantees, you all have the objective of being in compliance with the LIHEAP assurances, including Assurance 9, which requires that federal funding sources used to pay for LIHEAP administrative expenses do not exceed the maximum outlined in the LIHEAP statute. During our monitoring site visits, we have observed some grantees that have budgeted spending limits set up in their accounting systems that prevent exceeding the admin cost cap by not allowing expenses in excess of the cost cap to be funded by federal sources. This is an example of an automated preventive control activity. We have also observed manual detective control activities to mitigate the risk of exceeding the admin cost cap, such as grantees maintaining an Excel spreadsheet that tracks usage of all federal funding sources for LIHEAP admin expenses and reviewing it often to detect expenses that exceed the admin cost cap. If detected, this can be corrected by charging any admin expenses above the admin cost cap to non-federal sources of funding. As you can see from this example, one of the vital benefits of using built-in automated system controls, such as preset budgeted spending limits in your accounting system, is that you are building a controlled environment where you proactively try to prevent issues from occurring instead of having to resolve them after they occur. In our next webinar, we will showcase some notable practices for effective systems management.
Strong control activities play a significant role in the overall success of an organization, and there are many benefits of control activities. To name a few benefits, control activities help an organization reduce errors, safeguard assets, maintain compliance with laws and regulations, produce accurate and reliable reporting, detect and prevent improper payments, fraud, waste, and abuse, and maintain proper case file management. On the slide are a few more benefits we'd like to share with you. Please just take a moment to review them. Okay, so just like there are many benefits of control activities, there are also many examples of control activities that are applicable to both program and fiscal operation. And so let's go over a few of them. There's management and peer review. This control activity includes reviewing information, say there are reports or transaction and data, to verify accuracy. The review can be performed by management or another staff member that did not prepare or generate the information being reviewed. Some common examples of review control activities include reviewing the carryover and SF-425 reports and the supporting documentation prior to submission to verify the accuracy, or reviewing subgrantee expenditures prior to reimbursing subgrantees to verify expenditures are allowable and accurate, and also reviewing intake documentation prior to approval to help ensure only eligible clients are being served. There's segregation of duties. This control activity includes dividing or segregating key duties and responsibilities among different people to reduce the risk of error, misuse, or fraud. Because ideally, no one person should be able to initiate, record, authorize, and reconcile or review a transaction or activity. There's a sample tool that can help you with assigning key duties among different staff members. See the sample segregation of duties form on the LIHEAP Clearinghouse website. And a link to this document is included on the resources slide at the end of the presentation. Another example is reconciliation. This control activity includes comparing transactions and activities to relevant documentation and resolving any discrepancies that were discovered. Reconciliation control activities are aimed at verifying the accuracy and validity of transactions and activities. For example, reconciling the carryover amount from the carryover and reallotment report to the unobligated balance on the SF 425 report, or reconciling the cash receipts balance per the SF 425 report to data from the payment management system. And then finally, documentation. This control activity includes maintaining supporting documentation for all transactions, the performance of control activities, and other significant decisions or events in a manner that allows the documentation to be readily available for examination. For example, grantees should maintain documentation that supports LIHEAP funds were dispersed for allowable purposes and maintain complete client file documentation that supports applicant eligibility and benefit amount determinations. We have a few more examples to share that were just put up on the slide. Please take a moment to review them.
Hopefully by going over example control activities, a lot of you realize that you're already performing many of these activities, which is great. Or some of you may have realized that your organization could benefit from adding additional control activities within your program and fiscal processes. For those of you that came to that realization, hopefully this webinar will be a resource for improving your internal control environment. Now that we have discussed types, benefits, and examples of control activities, ask yourself if your control activities are effective. To help ensure you have effective control activities, your control activities should be documented through policies and procedures, communicated internally and externally, and reviewed periodically. We will discuss these three characteristics of effective control activities in more detail, starting with documenting control activities through policies and procedures. Before we get into the details of policies and procedures, let me remind you that control activities are actions established through policies and procedures to help achieve objectives and respond to risk. Current, comprehensive, written, implemented policies and procedures are a basis for strong internal controls. Policies and procedures are the strategic link between an organization's mission statement and day-to-day operations. Well-written policies and procedures allow employees to clearly understand their roles and responsibilities within predefined limits. Maintaining well-written policies and procedures is important for training new employees, ensuring compliance, improving processes, auditing and monitoring activities, and reducing the adverse impact of staff turnover. So some of you may be wondering, What exactly is the difference between policies and procedures? Policies are the guiding principles used to set direction aimed at achieving objectives within an organization. Policies provide guidance on why an action is performed. For LIHEAP grantees, many policies are driven by laws and regulations. Procedures are actions required to carry out or implement a policy or a process. They explain how a policy or process will be implemented.
Thanks, Audra. So a participant from our June webinar on single audits asked a great question during the Q&A segment on how to document procedures. And in this section, we'll provide some more guidance on just that, how to effectively document your procedures. And it's important to know that procedures can vary in the level of detail needed to explain how to carry out a process or implement a policy. The level of detail could vary depending on things such as the complexity of the process, the rate of change in the operating environment, the likelihood of error within the process, the level of risk within the process, and the frequency of staff turnover. Therefore, a process that is highly complex or has a high likelihood to result in error should have more detailed procedures than a simple process with a low probability of error. Procedures explain how to carry out a process. They clarify the who, what, when, and where details of performing a process. But again, depending on specific factors related to a process, it may not be necessary to provide details to answer all 4 questions in a procedures document. Very detailed, sequenced, step-by-step procedures that address all 4 questions are referred to as standard operating procedures, or SOPs.
Thanks, Jason. Now let's walk through an example of an SOP for a vendor agreement issuance process. The SOP could require that the LIHEAP coordinator, by October 1st of each fiscal year, obtain the state-prescribed vendor agreement from the state's website. Complete Section 1 of the vendor agreement by using information from the vendor servicing application that's found in the vendor module of the procurement system. Then forward the vendor agreement to the controller for review and signature, and then mail the vendor agreement to the vendor. This basic example of an SOP provided the details on who prepared vendor agreements. That's the LIHEAP coordinator. When vendor agreements are prepared, that would be by October 1st. What documentation is needed to complete the process? That would be the state-prescribed vendor agreement and the vendor servicing application. Where to find the documentation needed to complete the process? That would be the state's prescribed vendor agreement that was found on the state's website and the vendor servicing application that was in the vendor module of the procurement system. And lastly, who would be who reviews and approves the vendor agreement? That would be the controller. Regardless of the level of detail used to document a procedure, procedures should always provide significant guidance to staff on their roles and responsibilities for carrying out a process so that the organization's objectives are met. So now let's discuss a few tips for writing both program and fiscal procedures. First, know the guidance for which you are writing procedures for. Use existing organizational format and style guidance for procedural documentation. It's beneficial for the users to see uniformity between the formatting, style, and messaging of procedural documents. Procedures should be practical and implementable. Procedures should not be voluminous. Procedures should be written with the expectation that the primary user will be staff whose responsibilities will be described in the procedures. So it needs to be a job aid for them to enable quick and accurate decision making. And lastly, utilize existing effective procedures to help develop your procedures. Grantees can rely on and use lessons learned from each other. We encourage knowledge sharing for grantees to reach out to one another to find out what procedures are working well for other grantees. Also, the LIHEAP Clearinghouse includes sample state LIHEAP manuals and sample fiscal procedures, and at the 2019 LIHEAP Annual Conference, OCS provided guidance on developing tribal policy manuals. All LIHEAP grantees could benefit from using these resources as guides or a starting point for writing procedures so that you don't have to create procedures from scratch. Links to these resources will be included on the resources slide at the end of the presentation. But also, please keep in mind that grantees should follow their own policies, procedures, and any other relevant internal guidance when developing procedures.
Procedures should ensure all staff, both program and fiscal, working on LIHEAP have a comprehensive understanding of LIHEAP processes and control activities. As you are creating or updating procedural documentation, here are some examples of information to consider including in your procedures. Depending on the level of detail needed to explain a particular process, not all of this information would be needed for each process. LIHEAP process procedures could specify a process workflow, when specific actions should occur, who is responsible for the overall process, who is responsible for completing various elements within a process, program and policy requirements, training and educational resources, what information is needed to complete the process and where it can be found within the organization's systems, reporting requirements, when and where reports should be submitted and when they are required to be updated, supporting documents, what supporting documents are needed and where they should be maintained, and review and approval of information, how information should be reviewed to ensure accuracy and by whom. When you are thinking about documenting internal control activities in your program and fiscal processes, here are some examples of LIHEAP processes for which your organization could have documented implemented procedures that include adequate control activities. Please keep in mind that this list is not all-inclusive of LIHEAP processes that could require procedures. A few examples include refunds, intake, eligibility determination, obligating funds, subrecipient monitoring, and fraud, waste, and abuse. We have a few more examples to share that just appeared on the screen. Please take a moment to review them.
Thanks, Audra. So now we'd like to discuss how to communicate control activities, but before we do, we have another poll question for everybody. So for this, we ask, how many of the following control activities are utilized within your program? Management and peer review, system data entry verification, segregation of duties, reconciliation, or access restrictions and security. Please type the corresponding letter for your response in the questions box. Okay, so we're seeing a lot of C's come up. That is not surprising at all. We know you're doing great work, and it's saying that, you know, a lot of folks out there are implementing all of these control activities. A few B, very robust examples there. Some of you implementing 3 or 4 of the control activities. Mostly C's popping up, though. Wow, that's great. That's great to know. And again, this really helps us determine how best we can support you. So thank you for typing in your responses. We'll give you a few more moments. Wow, it's almost all C's now. Okay, great. The performance of these different control activities contribute to supporting key elements of your audit trail and your ability to have a clean audit as well. So again, thank you for your time and responding to that. It was great to see all those C's pop up on the screen and a few B's as well. Now that we know how to document control activities, let's discuss how and why to communicate control activities both internally and externally. Let's start with a discussion on how to effectively communicate control activities internally. So after you have well-documented policies and procedures that include strong control activities, you should then ensure those policies, procedures, and control activities are being performed. To implement control activities, they must be communicated to the relevant personnel who are responsible for performing the control activity. Communicating control activities internally is an ongoing process. Communication can be formal, informal, written, verbal, and in a multidimensional form from the top down, bottom up, and across the organization. Formal communication is usually written documentation, such as approved policies and procedures, distributed through hard copy or electronic format. Informal communication could include face-to-face meetings, and informal conversations often provide some of the most critical information needed to identify risks and opportunities and to explain complex concepts so that they are more easily understood. Please keep in mind that if your method of communication is verbal, it should be in support of, but not replace, the written documentation such as policies and procedures. Communication can also be top-down, bottom-up, and/or across the organization. This three-pronged approach can be an effective multidimensional way of sharing information. For the top-down approach, this means information is most likely coming from the LIHEAP coordinator or another member of management, for example, the controller or manager of LIHEAP fiscal operations, to the LIHEAP staff. A bottom-up approach for communication is also important and includes information coming from staff up to management. Management should welcome and listen to suggestions and feedback from staff, and staff should be comfortable enough to share their awareness of problems with managers who can act on that information. Lastly, it's also beneficial to communicate control activities across your organization, and this communication method could help your program by sharing effective control activities with other programs that operate closely with LIHEAP, or any other programs in your organization that have sound control activities. For instance, sharing control activities that help ensure case files are complete and audit ready. Be sure to always consider LIHEAP fiscal staff as key communication partners, as LIHEAP has a significant fiscal component. And if fiscal and program staff continuously collaborate and understand each other's control activities and work together to improve them, the outcome will be a stronger program. At the 2019 LIHEAP Annual Conference, OCS provided guidance on effective communication between LIHEAP fiscal and program staff in a presentation called Talking with Your Fiscal Shop. A link to that presentation is included on the resources slide at the end of the webinar. Now, let's move on to discuss external communications.
Not only is it important to properly communicate control activities internally, but it's also important to communicate control activities externally. Like internal communication, external communication is ongoing and can be formal, informal, written, verbal, and multidimensional. For example, from the grantee to the external party and from the external party back to the grantee. LIHEAP control activities should be communicated to several external parties, such as vendors, subgrantees, field offices, local administering agencies, auditors, and OCS monitors. So let's walk through some examples of external communication. First, there are vendors. Control activities can be communicated to vendors through vendor agreements or some form of memorandum of understanding. Next, there are subgrantees and field offices. Control activities can be communicated through contracts, agreements, memorandums of understanding, and the LIHEAP operations manual. It's a good idea to use these documents to communicate control activities around preventing, detecting, and reporting fraud, waste, and abuse. For other examples of information to include in these documents, please see sample vendor and local administering agency agreements found on the LIHEAP Clearinghouse website. Links to those resources are included in the resources slide at the end of the webinar. In addition to formal written documents, it's also beneficial to verbally discuss control activities with LIHEAP servicing partners through trainings and technical assistance sessions. Management should welcome and listen to suggestions and feedback from external parties as they can provide significant input on the delivery and quality of LIHEAP services. Please keep in mind it is not only important for your organization to have strong internal control and for your staff to be aware of the necessary control activities required to maintain a successful program, but as the primary recipient of federal funds, it's also important for you to ensure your partnering organizations have strong internal control and are aware of the necessary control activities that they should be performing in their day-to-day operations while providing LIHEAP services. And the final example is communicating control activities to auditors and OCS monitors. When grantees submit their annual LIHEAP plan each September, some key elements for internal controls are reported by grantees in Section 10 of the plan. These include responses regarding fiscal accounting and tracking of LIHEAP funds, monitoring and compliance of grantee activities and of local agencies, audit requirements, and any findings and corrective actions from audits and monitoring. And then in the course of monitoring reviews by OCS and during independent audits, grantees must be prepared to show relevant documentation regarding these key internal control elements and be able to discuss them in detail. So consider your relationship with auditors and monitors a partnering relationship, as auditors and monitors review your policies and procedures to provide feedback on gaps in control activities and or ineffective control activities. By addressing control activity deficiencies identified by auditors and monitors, you are strengthening the overall internal control and success of your program. As your LIHEAP monitors, we are partners with you with the same objective of having a successful program, and during our monitoring visits, we will provide feedback and technical assistance to you on ways your organization can improve its internal control. Regardless of the method or form of communication, communicating control activities to external parties helps your organization achieve its objectives.
Now, lastly, let's discuss the process for reviewing control activities. Since internal control is a process that has to adapt continually to the risk and changes an organization faces, reviewing control activities is important for helping internal control remain aligned with changing objectives, environment, laws, resources, and risk. Management should review control activities often and when significant process changes occur. Control activities should be reviewed for continued relevance, effectiveness in achieving objectives, and effectiveness in mitigating risk. Management's review should determine whether new control activities should be added to policies and procedures, or if existing control activities should be modified or removed from policies and procedures. When reviewing control activities to determine necessary updates, management could consider the following: prior monitoring and audit findings and whether their corrective action plans required control activity improvements, changes in objectives, personnel, operational processes, information technology and/or regulations, and adjustments and risk factors associated with LIHEAP processes. When reviewing control activities, it's important for management to seek feedback from internal staff members as well as external parties, as they can provide valuable insight on the quality of LIHEAP services and processes. For example, LIHEAP intake staff may experience first-hand issues with processing applications. Actively seeking input from intake staff can help ensure all risk factors are considered for application processing control activities. And who better to provide input than those working directly with that process? If management determines a control activity is no longer relevant or effective in achieving objectives or mitigating risk, management should promptly take corrective action. Corrective actions could include creating new or modifying existing control activities and/or creating new or modifying existing policies and procedures. But please remember to communicate any new or modified control activities, policies, and/or procedures to all relevant internal and external parties. The LIHEAP Clearinghouse includes a sample internal controls evaluation checklist that grantees could use to assist in the control activity review process. A link to this checklist will be included on the resources slide at the end of the presentation.
Thanks, Audra. So before we go over examples of OCS monitoring internal control issues, corrective action plans, and notable practices, here's another poll question. And you guys must be excited because I see you already responding to it. And we asked, does your program and fiscal staff work together to update procedures and control activities? And we are seeing a lot of yeses, a lot of A's popping up, a few B's. That's good to know as well. Most participants are saying yes, their program and fiscal staff do work together to update procedures and control activities. Good to know. We'll give you a few more moments to type in your responses into the chat pod. Mostly all A's for this question. A couple B's have come up, but mostly overwhelmingly A's. Okay, great. That's good to know. Thank you for your responses. And like I said earlier, it's helpful for us to get this sort of feedback on how your programs are operating. So as we mentioned earlier, we'd be showing some examples from our LIHEAP monitoring site visits that could help you improve your internal controls within your program. And we've noted both programmatic and fiscal related internal control issues during most of our recent site visits. And strong internal controls are extremely important for maintaining compliance with LIHEAP rules and regulations, as all LIHEAP assurances include an element of internal control. And the common internal control findings that we found were a lack of documented policies and procedures, lack of communicating policies and procedures, a lack of supporting documentation, lack of review, and a lack of reconciliation. We will go over each one of these examples, explaining the details of the finding and the corrective action plan to resolve the finding. We'll also provide a few examples of internal control notable practices we've observed during our site visits.
Thanks, Jason. As mentioned earlier, for effective internal control, control activities should be documented, communicated, and reviewed. Well-written and communicated policies and procedures allow employees to clearly understand their roles and responsibilities for helping their organization meet its objectives. So here are examples from our monitoring site visits where grantees either didn't have or the policies and procedures they did have were insufficient and did not properly document control activities. They are preventing and detecting waste, fraud, and abuse, process drawdowns, preparing, reviewing, submitting, and are revising the SF-425 and carryover report, tracking administrative cost and a definition for administrative cost, reconciling and processing vendor payments, processing refunds, tracking obligations and a definition for obligating LIHEAP funds, and tracking and monitoring the corrective actions of single audit findings. To address this issue, grantees were required to provide OCS with copies of implemented written policies and procedures. These policies and procedures had to ensure that all staff working on LIHEAP had a comprehensive understanding of the program and that robust internal control activities were implemented. For each LIHEAP process, the procedures could specify who is responsible for the overall process and for completing various elements within the process, program and policy requirements, what information is needed to complete the process, and where it can be found within the grantee systems. Reporting requirements, when and where reports should be submitted and when they are required to be updated. Supporting documents, what supporting documents are needed and where they should be maintained, and review and approval of information, how information should be reviewed to ensure accuracy and by whom.
Now let's look at some examples where grantees did not effectively communicate policies, procedures, and control activities to its fiscal staff, sub-grantees, and/or vendors. It is not enough to just have documented policies and procedures. Although that is a necessary and important first step, LIHEAP grantees must also effectively communicate relevant policies and procedures internally and externally. During our monitoring site visits, we observed sub-grantees that had not been given any guidance or training on how to prevent or detect waste, fraud, and abuse, and therefore they were unsure of how to perform their duties over this area. Also, at another grantee, we observed that the program staff was aware of fraud, waste, and abuse procedures, but the fiscal staff was not. The fiscal staff was also not included on discussions regarding fraud concerns. It is important to include fiscal staff in these discussions, as well as the continuous development of fraud policies and procedures, especially since they are usually approving and reviewing supporting documentation sent by sub-grantees for payment. We also observed a couple of instances where vendor refund procedures and control activities had not been properly communicated. Specifically, fiscal staff did not know how to handle vendor refunds from prior years, and vendors and sub-grantees were not provided guidance on when and how to submit refunds to grantees. To address this issue, grantees had to develop an implemented written plan to distribute its policies and procedures on preventing, detecting, and reporting cases of waste, fraud, and abuse, and handling vendor refunds to its fiscal staff, vendors, and sub-grantees, to ensure that all who work on LIHEAP are aware of the control activities within these processes. They also had to provide OCS with confirmation that they had distributed these policies and procedures to relevant internal and external parties, and provide verification that training had been provided to ensure these policies and procedures were implemented by all.
Thanks, Audra. And during some of our monitoring site visits, grantees did not perform control activities to maintain adequate supporting documentation for LIHEAP transactions and for proper case file management. First, we'll discuss the lack of supporting documentation for LIHEAP General Ledger or GL transactions. During our site visits, we select a sample of LIHEAP transactions from the grantee's GL and request that the grantee provide supporting documentation so that we can verify the accuracy and validity of the selected transactions. However, during one of our visits, the grantee was not able to provide adequate supporting documentation for two of the sample transactions. Without being able to review complete supporting documentation for the selected transactions, we couldn't verify that LIHEAP funds were used for necessary and allowable purposes. The result was that nearly $100,000 of LIHEAP funds became question costs. To address this issue, the grantee had to provide OCS with the required supporting documentation, knowing that not providing adequate supporting documentation of the question costs could possibly result in those costs being disallowed, which would result in repayment of funds to HHS.
Next, let's discuss the lack of supporting documentation for proper case file management. While reviewing case files, we found instances where LIHEAP client case files lacked required documentation to support benefit payments, applicant eligibility, and the timing of crisis intervention. Specifically, the case files were missing proof of LIHEAP benefit payments to vendors, proof of LIHEAP applicant income, proof of a utility bill for the applicant, and documentation that a crisis intervention took place within the required 48-hour time frame for a non-life-threatening crisis. To address the issue, the grantee had to develop a procedure to ensure all required documents are kept in each case file, and the grantee had to provide OCS with a written copy of this newly implemented procedure, which had to include who is responsible for ensuring the files are complete, the documents required for each case file, for example, a document checklist, and a template of any other documents used in the effort to ensure complete files.
Now let's look at examples where grantees did not perform control activities to review administrative costs and subgrantee expenditures. First, we will discuss lack of review over administrative costs. By not reviewing admin costs, grantees are at a risk of exceeding the admin cost cap. Any federal funds used to administer LIHEAP must not exceed the maximum allowable amount outlined in the LIHEAP statute. If the cost of administering LIHEAP exceeds the maximum allowable amount, then the grantee must use non-federal funds to account for expenses over the admin cost cap. Review of admin costs should not only occur at the grantee level, but also at the subgrantee level. During one of our monitoring site visits, the grantee could not tell us how much was spent to administer LIHEAP, as they could not readily identify admin costs on their general ledger. Although program and fiscal staff compare and reconcile the total amount of LIHEAP expenses on a regular basis, amounts charged to specific LIHEAP categories, including admin costs, were not being reviewed and reconciled. During another monitoring site visit, the grantee was not aware that their subgrantees were using other federal sources of funding to cover admin costs incurred by LIHEAP. Without reviewing and tracking all relevant admin costs impacting the program, the grantee was not able to ensure that they remained within the admin cost cap. To address this issue, the grantee had to provide OCS with implemented written procedures to demonstrate adequate review and tracking of all admin costs for LIHEAP that enabled the grantee to verify the precise total of LIHEAP admin expenses supported by all federal sources of funding.
Let's discuss lack of review over subgrantee expenditures. LIHEAP grantees must ensure that they are effectively reviewing subgrantee expenditures. As LIHEAP grantees, you are the prime recipients of LIHEAP funds and are responsible for program integrity. During our monitoring site visits, we observed grantees that did not perform formal on-site physical monitoring of their subgrantees that included reviewing a sample of LIHEAP transactions. These grantees also did not request and review supporting documentation for monthly reimbursement requests. By not reviewing subgrantee expenditures, these grantees were unable to ensure LIHEAP funds were used for allowable purposes and in compliance with federal statutes and regulations. This puts these grantees at an increased risk of improper usage of LIHEAP funds by their subgrantees. During the site visit for one of the grantees who was not reviewing subgrantee expenditures, we identified a couple of unallowable expenses dispersed by their subgrantee that resulted in disallowed costs. Because of that, the grantee was required to return those disallowed funds to HHS. If that grantee had been reviewing subgrantee expenditures, maybe they could have identified that their subgrantee was using LIHEAP funds for unallowable costs and corrected the issue sooner before it became an issue of noncompliance in their monitoring report. To address this issue, the grantees were required to provide OCS with an implemented written monitoring plan that included procedures for reviewing a sample of supporting documents for transactions selected from each subgrantee's general ledger during fiscal monitoring and/or when reviewing monthly reimbursement requests.
Next, let's look at a different example from our monitoring site visits where grantees did not perform reconciliation control activities for benefit payments. Several grantees did not reconcile LIHEAP benefit prepayments, that is, where LIHEAP benefit payments for the full eligible benefit amount were paid to utility companies against actual energy usage by clients. Most of these grantees had not established a control activity to perform this reconciliation. Instead, they relied solely on vendors to provide notice to them if an overpayment was made or if refunds were due back to the grantees. By not having their own method to detect overpayments, the grantees were at an increased risk of misspending LIHEAP funds, especially if vendors were not identifying and notifying them of all overpayments. At one grantee, the benefit payment procedures did include this reconciliation control activity. However, they were not performing it on a consistent basis and therefore were also at an increased risk of misspending LIHEAP funds if their vendors were not identifying and notifying them of all overpayments. To address this issue, the grantees were required to provide OCS with implemented written procedures to reconcile vendor prepayments, and these procedures were to specify the documentation that energy vendors must submit to demonstrate that LIHEAP benefits were provided and the cost of the benefits, and a process for reviewing this documentation that ensures benefits were provided and determines whether refunds are due to the grantee.
Let's discuss an example of a lack of reconciliation between balances reported on the SF-425 and the carryover report prior to submission to OCS. During our monitoring site visits, we observed grantees that did not reconcile the unobligated balance reported on the SF-425 to the carryover amount reported on the carryover report. When comparing these report balances for the same fiscal year, these two balances should be consistent with one another. This reconciliation was usually not performed due to a lack of communication between the program staff who prepares one of the reports and the fiscal staff who prepares the other report. To address this issue, grantees were required to provide implemented written procedures for completing and updating the SF-425 and carryover reports. These procedures were to specify who is responsible for completing each report, what information is needed to complete each report and where it can be found within the grantee systems, when reports should be submitted and when they are required to be updated, where reports should be submitted, for example, OLDC, and where supporting documents should be maintained, and how reports should be reviewed prior to submission to ensure accuracy of information, including how they should be reconciled with one another to ensure consistency. And the grantee had to provide an updated copy of the SF-425 and or the carryover report so that the reports are in agreement with one another. We also want to remind grantees that when comparing report balances for the same fiscal year, there should be consistency not only between the unobligated balance per the SF-425 and the carryover amount per the carryover report, but also the carryover amount reported on the LIHEAP grantee survey.
Thanks, Audra. So now that we've gone over internal control issues from our monitoring site visits, we also wanted to share some notable internal control practices. We've seen a lot of LIHEAP grantees do some commendable practices through our monitoring. We've observed notable review and reconciliation control activities implemented to verify the accuracy of LIHEAP expenditures and required reports. For example, one grantee's program staff utilizes Excel to track all LIHEAP expenses, and the program staff meet with the LIHEAP accountant on a regular basis to compare these cumulative expenses with accounting's general ledger expenditure report for the same period. And in doing so, any identified discrepancies are reconciled. At another grantee, multiple reviews occur for key processes. For example, the data reported on the SF-425 report is reviewed prior to submission, and the data reviews occur between an accountant, the accounting supervisor, and the controller, and the review includes cash receipts being verified and reconciled against relevant internal reports as well as data in the payment management system. And as part of one grantee's subgrantee monitoring process, a sample selection of subgrantee weatherization job labor hours is tested and reconciled with invoice amounts on a month-to-month basis and during annual on-site monitoring for all sub-grantees.
Also, at a couple of grantees, we observed notable automated system verification control activities implemented to help ensure accurate benefit payments. For example, one grantee's IT staff created a program that allows large utility companies to run a report that matches approved client application in the grantee's client management system with existing accounts at that utility company. And at another grantee, as part of their benefit payment review process, for each check run, an Excel-based duplications report is generated in which transactions are sorted to determine if there are any potential duplicates. Possible duplications are then investigated and resolved.
And lastly, at a couple of grantees, we observed notable practices for documenting, communicating, and reviewing control activities. These practices help ensure relevant staff know how to perform control activities and illustrate program staff, fiscal staff, and sub-grantees working together and discussing procedures to enhance control activities within their programs. At one grantee, to maintain compliance with its state's accounting policies, the grantee developed an internal control plan and reviews it annually. Each agency head and the chief financial officer certify that the internal control plan has been reviewed. The internal control plan is considered a working document used by each agency to identify how things are supposed to be done. Annually, each agency reviews the plan, compares it to how things are actually operating, and makes changes as appropriate. Another grantee's weatherization sub-grantee fiscal officers meet quarterly for half a day. Their meetings cover important fiscal items and provide opportunities for the sub-grantees to share notable practices. And at another grantee, the LIHEAP coordinator sends program and fiscal training invites to all LIHEAP staff. So program staff is able to learn from fiscal training sessions and vice versa. Also, the program and fiscal staff meet quarterly to discuss key LIHEAP operational topics, such as internal reports and cash flow management. This grantee also holds monthly and quarterly trainings to communicate policies, procedures, and control activities related to fraud prevention, contracts management, financial processes, accounting systems, and procurement.
So hopefully from this webinar, you've learned more about internal controls and why they're important, as well as the requirements and regulations for internal controls. We encourage you to implement the guidance provided on documenting, communicating, and reviewing control activities into your own programs. It's always great to learn from real examples regarding issues of non-compliance and notable practices. So hopefully those examples added value to the conversation. And lastly, please consider reviewing the Green Book and COSO's Internal Control Integrated Framework for in-depth information on establishing strong internal control within your organization, which is key for a successful program. Here are the links to references we made throughout the presentation and other useful guidance. For example, there are links to ACF and LIHEAP terms and conditions for your LIHEAP grant award. And here are links to the OCS resources we discussed throughout the presentation and some additional OCS resources that could help strengthen internal control within your programs. And here are links to additional resources that should help you with other aspects of your program. The LIHEAP website navigator tool, which is listed at the bottom of the slide, is a great tool to start off with, as you can use it to look for a lot of relevant LIHEAP guidance and information, including many of the other resources that are listed on this slide. Thank you all for your time, and Iris, back to you.
All right, thank you, ICF, for such a great job on a lot of information that's helpful to us. To recap some of those important issues on internal control activities, once you've determined the effective internal controls that are needed for your specific program, first thing you want to do is document those policies. Having written policies and procedures in place ensures consistency throughout your agency. Second, you want to communicate those policies to everyone under your LIHEAP program, both programmatic and fiscal. Lastly, you want to review those policies periodically to ensure they are still effective. As changes occur within your agency, you may need to revise those policies to meet your current needs. On this slide, you'll see the fiscal points of contact within the LIHEAP office. The first one is myself. Here is my email address and phone number, and I cover the odd regions. And John Thompson, the other auditor, we have his email address and phone number, and John covers the even regions. But if you reach out to either one of us, we'll, work on getting you an answer. If we don't know the answer, we'll, talk to other people until we can get you the answer. But we want you to feel free to reach out to us. And don't forget your regional liaisons. That's going to be Kate Thomas, Josephine Rago-Adia, Patrice West, and Vicki Pretlow. You can also reach out to them, and we'll work internally to get you an answer to any questions that you may have. While having effective internal controls is an ongoing responsibility of LIHEAP grantees, make sure you're brainstorming within your agency and with your local partners about ways to continue implementing those controls during this pandemic and without creating unnecessary health risks for those involved. Make use of virtual platforms, phone calls, online information, and other strategies to keep informed about what is happening on your behalf. So we've gone through a lot of information, and we want to hear from you. So please let us know if you have any questions, and we're going to open the phone lines at this time. You can either ask your question or you can put it in the chat pod.
We'll now begin our formal question and answer session. If you would like to ask a question by phone, please press star 1 on your telephone keypad. Unmute your phone and record your first and last name only. To withdraw your question, you may press star 2. One moment for the first question. Ask your question by phone, please press star 1 at this time. And at this time, we have no questions by phone.
Okay. So we did have some questions that we wanted to put up for you so that we can get this conversation started while you're thinking of additional questions. Can we go to that first question that we thought might be helpful? How often do I need to revise my internal control policies and procedures? Anyone on our team want to answer that?
Hi, Iris. This is John Thompson. I can go ahead and answer that.
Okay, thank you, John.
Sure. Hello, everybody. And so from the first question that Iris just proposed about when to or how often to revise your internal controls, your internal control policies and procedures, I want to point out from the first poll question that we saw, that was very interesting to see what was the most challenging activity for internal controls, and the majority of answers were centered around implementing activities to achieve compliance or just ensuring to maintain compliance. Our experience in the field shows that that is very accurate, and this webinar covered some very good topics, as for example, like control activities, segregation of duties, reconciliation, control activities which center around segregation of duties, reconciliations, maintain the proper documentation, to name a few. And so while there's no set time an agency should revise their internal controls, it's definitely, as Iris pointed out in her summary, definitely important that they should be reviewed periodically. Now, periodically would be what your agency determines they should be. Considering how things are rapidly evolving within our program and the other federal programs that you may be managing, we would definitely say that not revising your, coming back to your policies in a few years is not a good idea. Periodically should probably center around, every other year or 1 year, something like that. That's periodic. I think a good benchmark would be when you review your model plan every year. That would be something that everyone here could do, and give you a chance to see how your control activities are, your documentation, so that would be a good time. And it's also important to remember that the purpose of internal controls is to establish compliance, as was also mentioned during the webinar. So with that said, internal controls should be revisited when there's an external agency that recommends that there should be changes, like if you have an external audit or even a monitoring visit from our agency, from HHS. So there's no, like I said, there's no set time, but definitely some of those examples would be good times when you could revisit your internal control policy and procedures.
All right. Thank you so much, John. Great answer.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other questions at this time?
We have no questions by the phone.
Okay. How about we go to our second question? What types of changes in my organization should prompt revised internal controls, policies, and procedures? Anyone from our team want to answer that question?
Iris, this is Chetan. I could answer it.
Okay, thank you, Chetan.
Okay. Before I get to this, after I finish this response, we do have some questions on the chat pod from a few people.
Okay.
Okay, so the question is, what types of changes in the organization should prompt revised internal control policies and procedures? I won't try to recreate the answer because we've addressed some of it really well in the presentation. So, again, we're trying to help people think through that your internal control should be focused on achieving objectives, reducing risk. So, again, just on one of the slides, we discussed 3 broad categories of objectives for internal controls, and those were, operations, reporting, and compliance. So in terms of organizational changes, if something requires a change in key operations or reporting requirements or compliance requirements, then revisit your policies and procedures for them to see whether revisions are needed. A few specific examples when this could be needed are if there are monitoring and audit findings, especially if they have corrective actions that required improvements to your internal controls. If you have, personnel changes to operational processes, if you have changes to your, IT setup, and or, changes to regulations, those are all good times to revisit your internal control policies and procedures to see whether revisions are needed.
All right, thank you so much, Chetan. I'm going to try to take some of the questions that I see in the chat pod. And one of the questions is they're asking that we go back and show the resource slide so that maybe you can, take a picture of that slide. So can we go back to that, please? Okay. So here is our OCS resources. a tribal policy manual development, talking with your fiscal shop, LIHEAP fiscal program integrity issue booth. We really got some good resources. And I just want to, if you're looking at that, maybe taking some notes, I just want to remind you that this session today is being recorded. And so it's going to take a little bit of time. We have to make sure that it's 508 compliant and everything is the way it should be. But this webinar will be available on the LIHEAP website. So once we go through all the proper channels that we need to make sure that it's okay, we will send out a message to all of you, our grantees, to let you know that it's on our website so that not only can you see the slides, as several of you have asked about, but you'll also be able to listen to the recorded session. Another question is, what is the deadline for the 2021 application? I believe that deadline is still September 1st, and I can double check with our program staff to see if that date has changed, but it's, I believe it's still September 1st of 2020. Will the presentation be on the website? It will. It may take us maybe a couple of weeks, but we'll definitely send out a notice to you to let you know when it's available. Another question, how often are states audited? Most states are audited annually. Whether your LIHEAP program will be audited or not will depend on whether it is considered a major program. And I think as Dee Dee mentioned earlier, if you have a total of $750,000 worth of federal funds, and that's for a combination of all of your federal funds, then you would be audited. And if LIHEAP is considered major, they would look at your LIHEAP files at that time. Next question, would it be more useful to have standard operating procedures for both program and fiscal component in LIHEAP? Would anyone on our team like to take that question?
Iris, I could address that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, John, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was actually talking on mute. So, yeah, that's fine. I think we're going to say the same thing. But, yes, Casey, actually it is more useful if you have standard operating procedures for both components. And the reason why is because it provides an opportunity to be more compliant. And what I mean by that is during we give out multiple, let me backtrack. Our program staff, they give guidance out on their quarterly calls in reference to areas that that need to be, such as reports that need to be submitted for programmatic compliance in order for our operations to continue on here. And fiscally, we speak about areas that, reports that need to be submitted in order to provide more of an overall picture of your fiscal operations that also tie into the overall operations of LIHEAP. And so the more granular you can be with each component of LIHEAP, not only will that provide more specificity to your whole operations, but that gives us back at the office a better idea of how your operation is moving forward. So, you know, we've seen operating procedures with just one component of, you know, whether it be program or fiscal, but just they only have one component that's fleshed out. And so what has happened is because of the lack of the procedures for the other program that's not fleshed out, that will lead to findings and recommendations on our part that eventually will lead to the grantee forming standard operating procedures for the part that is lacking. So, that's just the long answer to say yes. So, yes, the more specific, the better.
All right, thank you, John.
Mm-hmm.
And again, you wanted to know, will these slides be available on the website? Yes, they will. They won't be available immediately. We have to make sure they're 508 compliant, go through other channels just to make sure the information is presentable. But at that time, we will send out email to all of our grantees to let you know that they are available. And that's not just for this presentation, but that's for all of the presentations of the two we've already had, this one today, and also for the fourth and final one, which we'll be presenting on Thursday, August the 27th. So we will let you know when those are available. Do most states review expenditures prior to reimbursement or just doing monitoring reviews? I'm assuming you're asking this question of us based on our compliance reviews, I believe. So do most states review expenditures prior to reimbursement or just doing monitoring reviews? I'll take a stab at this question. We like you to do that during, prior to the reimbursement and not just at the monitoring reviews. And the reason that we suggest that is, as you are reviewing the expenditures on an ongoing basis, if there is something that is not correct, whether it is just maybe an error, if you catch it early on, as we talked about, that will help you to prevent, those dollars becoming so large that it's kind of out of control. So the sooner you catch any problems with expenditure reports or how the dollars are being spent, taking, for example, admin costs, if one of your local agencies exceed the amount of admin funding that you're giving them, and then they're using another federal funding source, if you're looking at those expenditures and you're looking at the sources of funding that they're using, it's so much better to catch that early, when the dollar amounts are smaller, than to wait until you go out and do a monitoring review maybe a year or even 2 years later. The earlier you catch it, the better you're going to be at stopping it and then correcting that problem. Did we have any other questions on the line?
And at this time, we still have a question.
Okay. All right. So it looks like, we're past our time. It's actually 3:32. Thank you all so much for your questions and just for joining us on this webinar to discuss the important topic of internal controls for effective LIHEAP program and fiscal management. And again, we'll give you a notification as soon as these slides are available and the recorded conversation. We hope to talk to you all again soon at our next webinar. And again, that's proposed on Thursday, August the 27th, where we're going to discuss tips for developing a risk assessment tool and showcase of some notable program and fiscal practices from the Federal LIHEAP compliance reviews. Thanks to everyone, and stay safe, and we'll talk to you later.